Alright, the next program in the What Makes This Program Tick series is from the Strength Athlete. It is their Generalized Intermediate program. This is a free program they released, and it's, I believe, made by Bryce Lewis, who is a pretty accomplished powerlifter, and his team in general is very accomplished. They coach a lot of high-level guys, so I think they have the bona fides there to really put together a good training program. They have a lot of services available, and I think they're worth taking a look at. So let's go straight into what the program looks like. What makes it tick? So this this fictional athlete has a normalized powerlifting total. That means every lift has been set at 1 RM of 100. And what that lets us do is look at tonnage from a normalized perspective. In terms of what you're seeing, in terms of top for squats, bench press, deadlift, about working up to about 9 sets of squats per week, 20 sets of bench presses, which to me is a good amount. I like that. And deadlifts upwards to 8. So not necessarily any character coming out too much other than he loves bench press, but I think that that is an adequate amount of volume, about as much as you need. So in terms of what variations you're seeing, you are seeing, I don't know if all of them transfer over here, close grip bench press, pause deadlifts, overhead press, and I think that's the bulk of it. Now, the way this program is delivered, it is delivered as an RPE and percent-based program. Most of the accessory work is actually RPE, and I believe as you progress on, you'll get a lot more RPE-type prescriptions. However, a lot of the main work is actually percent-based. I have translated them all to RPEs just because of how this template works, but that's generally how it happens, right? So what's it doing? What is it doing? So you are starting at 72.5-ish% and building your way up to about 95% of 1 RM on the average. Now, in terms of that's average intensity. In terms of relative intensity, which means how close you are to grind town, that's something else. It builds up, so you start out very low, actually. 87% in terms of relative intensity is really low. That means that's starting you out about average of 6 RPE, if you want to think of it that way. And then in the end, if you look at week 9, it's actually taking you to 100% relative intensity. However, absolute intensity isn't completely there. I believe it's like 3 RMs or something that you're building off of. And what about the tonnage? What does the tonnage say? So we know we want to be north of 0.5. We want to be south of 1.3 at best, but absolutely not get above 1.8. Everything is within the sweet spot. You even look at this peak week, that's still north of 0.5. So that's good. So that makes sense. And you can see the loading pattern is generally you're going to increase reps, increase volume, and you are increasing intensity at the same time, which isn't necessarily my favorite, but considering how low relative intensity you start off with, I think it's acceptable and reasonable. And then as intensity really picks up, I really do like how this average relative intensity kind of either flattens or decreases. Here's what the number of sets look like per week, so you can see that they generally increase. For squats, it seems like you really pick up between week 1 and week 2, but it seems all pretty reasonable to me. And once you include accessory work, is it still within the sweet spot? Yes, it is. And you could definitely see that week 1 to week 2 tonnage pickup. And that might just be due to squats. So what is the loading pattern here? Does it make sense? Well, if you look at the squats, you're starting off 75% and below. Bench press, a lot more differential loading, but I think you need that with bench press. In deadlifts, you're south of 80% the whole time, or first week. And you see it gradually transitions into higher and higher intensities. And you see that huge black bar on deadlifts and squats on the last week. But when you consider that that's actually only a couple sets, I think it's only like, yeah, it's like 1 to 4 sets. That's why. Because this is all broken down as percentage of that work, right? So it seems like it progresses in a very predictable pattern. And it makes sense. I can't fault it there. So average intensity, 72 to 95.5. That complexity, which you could normally see with average standard deviation of average intensity, about 4% at the most. With bench press, a little bit higher, but I think that's to be expected since you have a lot more differential loading here. And deadlift, you kind of get the same thing, especially around week 4. So week 4, that's when you have a huge, like 70 to 75 is where a lot of it is, and the other half is like 80 to 85. So I think that's where it mostly comes from. So differential loading there, not a huge deal. And it follows a very straightforward, linear, and logical progression. Although it is kind of like a pyramid build. So you build up the work, and then you peak down for intensity. So does it make sense? Yeah, it makes sense. So, 3 criteria. Safety. Does it make sense? Or is it safe? I think everything generally is right where it should be in terms of safety. I don't think there's an issue with that there. Now, and is it ordered? Well, yes, I do think it is. It is usually a main lift, a variation, and then some accessory work. And I do think all of those do make sense. So no fault of it there. So then the next thing is adherence. Is it? Can you understand it? And I think the reliance on intensities, at least for main work, is kind of a strength because say what you want about RPE, but I do think it is harder for RPE to be followed for the average person because the average person, even if they do know about RPE, it's not something that they're most versed in, especially if they're following a program that has some variations that they're not used to. So I do think it's easy enough to understand because even when it does involve RPE, you've had a lot of exposure to it through accessory work. And if there's anything that you could afford to screw up, it's accessory work. And, once you start getting RPEs when it comes to close variations and main lifts, it's normally later in the program. So I think it is good and implemented well there, and it is done so in an understandable way. So outcomes. Does it do what it means to do? Does it seem like it's headed in a general direction? Yeah, it does. It looks like it's supposed to make you stronger. That's pretty obvious. So yeah, I think it does a good enough job on that. This is pretty cut and dry. Would I recommend the program? Yeah, I would. I have no reason why I wouldn't. It comes from a good group, and if you see the template, it is one of the most beautifully designed templates. I am jealous of how aesthetic they are, and I have tried to mimic just how aesthetic everything is in my own templates. So yeah, I would say it makes perfect sense. And here's the funny part. I've entered this all into my own program, or my own template, just to analyze stats. But we do have a lot of onboard stats in the template anyway, so you're going to see a lot of the same stuff that you see here. And the fact that someone is looking at stuff from a data perspective gives me confidence. Because anyone could write out any program that they just think, oh, yeah, it kind of makes sense. But if you look at the data, it might not make sense. Like, yeah, you might think it follows a logical progression, but it might not actually. And I think that's apparent in some other programs, but this one seems like it's coming from a good spot. It makes perfect sense. I'd recommend it. And yeah, couldn't say anything nicer about it.